Hello, and welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Anita Warren with the Friends of History, and will be your host today. Today's lecture is The Only Wonderful Things, the Creative Partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis by our guest speaker, Dr. Melissa J. Homestead. Our monthly First Wednesday lectures are provided free of charge by the Friends of History of the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. Your contributions directly support the lecture series as well as programs and exhibits at the New Mexico History Museum. Should you wish to give a gift, and any amount is appreciated, please go to our website, friendsofhistorynm.org, and click on the donate button at the top of the page. Now, let's meet our presenter. Dr. Melissa J. Homestead is a professor of English and program faculty in Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she also directs the Cather Project, co-edits the complete letters of Willa Cather, and co-directs a digital library of Willa Cather's literary manuscripts. In addition to her many publications on Willa Cather, Dr. Homestead has published widely on American women's writing from the colonial era through the 19th century. Pulitzer Prize winner Willa Cather was one of the greatest American writers of the early 20th century, writing on a variety of subjects and characters. Her editor throughout was Edith Lewis, and together they forged a remarkable and productive relationship lasting nearly 40 years. Dr. Homestead will share an overview of their personal and creative partnership as covered in her book, The Only Wonderful Things, the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, and will also give special attention to their shared travels in the American Southwest that inspired Cather's novels, The Professor's House, and Death Comes for the Archbishop. And now, let's welcome Dr. Melissa J. Homestead.
So hello, everyone. I'm happy to be presenting for the Friends of New Mexico History on my book, The Only Wonderful Things, the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, which was published by Oxford University Press 3 years ago. I'll begin with an overview of the entire book, and then in line with the focus of this organization, I'll return to chapter 3, which focuses on Willa Cather and Edith Lewis's southwestern U.S. travels, including to New Mexico, to talk in more detail about their visits to New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and how they inform two of Cather's novels. So there are two strands of argument throughout my book, signaled in my title by the phrase creative partnership. First, that is two ambitious career women, and here they are in a photograph together in Jaffrey, New Hampshire in 1926. Cather and Lewis created a romantic and domestic partnership that allowed them to enjoy love and intimacy and to pursue their ambitions. Second, that as an editor, Lewis was a partner in Cather's creative process and also used her expertise in advertising to help craft Cather's image as an author. This is a page from The Professor's House with Edith Lewis's handwriting. My book starts and ends at the old burying ground in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where Cather and Lewis are buried side by side. I hope by the end of my book, I have succeeded in undoing the mythology about the gravesite that has obscured Lewis's place in Cather's life. Having started at the end, and with my own first visit to Jaffrey in the autumn of 1984, I turned the clock back, introducing Edith Lewis as the young woman Willa Cather first met in Lincoln, Nebraska in August 1903 at the home of Sarah Harris, publisher of the Lincoln Courier. And this is the Harris house. It's Sarah Harris's mother and brother who also live there in the picture. Delving briefly into Lewis's New England family history, I paint a picture of her family's life in Nebraska before she herself emerged into public view as an adolescent, studying at the University of Nebraska. She's in the front row of her sorority picture, and publishing short stories in the Lincoln Courier. She transferred to Smith College. There she is in the back row with her literary society, where she met Oxa Barlow, an important character in the book, and this is Oxa, and from which both of the women graduated in 1902. Chapter 2 follows Lewis to New York City, where she moved after a year back in Lincoln teaching school. And this is South Washington Square, where she moved. 60 South Washington Square has the curved lintel over the doorway. And it traces I trace the growth of her relationship with Cather, both personal and professional, from the first meeting in 1903 through about 1918. And 1906, in fact, when Cather moved to New York City, she took a room in the same rooming house where Edith Lewis was living. From 1906, both Cather and Lewis worked at McClure's magazine, and I argue that the magazine office was the crucible of their collaborative work on Cather's fiction. And this, in fact, is the first evidence of Edith Lewis editing Willa Cather. It's a poem published in the magazine, and that's Edith Lewis's handwriting editing the poem. In my book, I argue that Cather and Lewis, in choosing to make a home together in 1908, were emulating Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. So this is the place where they first made their home together on Washington Place. They're emulating Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. This is a picture of them, Jewett on the left and Fields on the right, identified by most scholars as the prototypical Boston marriage, a category of socially accepted, committed romantic relationships between women in the late 19th century United States. In any event, after Cather left McClure's, Lewis moved on to Every Week magazine, and I recover Lewis's work as an editor of fiction there and the ways that her work intersected with Cather's creative work at the time. So on the right is an illustration from My Antonia by W.T. Benda. And on the left, W.T. Benda illustrated a story in Every Week magazine at the same time using the same model, in fact, as you can see by their dresses. In chapter 3, I turn back the clock to 1915 to tell the story of Cather and Lewis's 4 shared trips to the U.S. Southwest. And this, in fact, is them at Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde in 1915. Throughout the book, Lewis's editing of Cather's fiction is a key theme, but I linger over the evidence here because the first surviving edited type draft of one of Cather's novels is The Professor's House. And here again, Edith Lewis editing The Professor's House, which was grounded in their 1915 and 1916 Southwestern trips. Their Southwestern trips, and this is a map actually from 1915, and I'll be talking about this later. Their Southwestern travels in 1925 and 1926, here they are on horseback during one of those trips, inspired Death Comes for the Archbishop. Although there is no type draft of that novel, there is a rich record of their travel and literary collaboration. And as I mentioned, again, I'll be returning to that and to these images in more detail. After mining the record of Cather and Lewis's experiences together in the desert Southwest, I focus in chapter 4 on Lewis's career as an advertising copywriter at the J. Walter Thompson Company, arguing that her advertising copy for soap and hand lotion and Cather's fiction are in conversation with one another. Here they are literally on the same page of a magazine. Cather's story, Uncle Valentine and the Women's Home Companion, ad stripped, so that's a later part of the story, next to an advertisement for Jergens lotion, photographs by Edward Steichen, and all of the advertising copy by Edith Lewis. I also hypothesize that Lewis was behind the famous Edward Steichen portrait of Cather published in Vanity Fair in 1927. And so we have Lewis on the we have Lewis's advertising copy on the right for Jergens lotion again, and the photograph of hands says Steichen underneath it, taken by Steichen, and then the photograph of Willa Cather in Vanity Fair, also by Edward Steichen. Lewis started in advertising in 1919, and she and Cather first summered on Grand Manan Island in 1922. Here they are, dressed up for adventure in a different climate from the Southwest, but wearing the same sorts of outfits. I devote a separate chapter to their many summers there, both before and after they built their own cottage at Whale Cove. And here it is, a little photograph hand tinted with watercolor by Edith Lewis, who avocationally did watercolor on the island, and a little note by Willa Cather at the top saying, "This is our little home." Cather has been portrayed as living in isolation on the island, but she was living with Lewis, who was actually the legal owner of the land and the cottage. Furthermore, at Whale Cove, they were part of a community of women and only women. In this chapter, I focus both on their collaborative work on stories collected in the volume Obscure Destinies, and this is Two Friends, which was published in Obscure Destinies, and all of the editing, again, is Edith Lewis's, and on how the both of them responded to the deaths of their parents in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and I think those things are related. I also see them moving past grief in the 1930s by inviting sisters and nieces to visit them on the island. And this is Cather with her niece, Mary Virginia Auld, at Grand Manan in the early 1930s. In my last full chapter, I take them back to New York City, where they settled into a large apartment at 570 Park Avenue in 1932. In 1927, they had lost their Greenwich Village apartment to subway construction and camped out in an apartment hotel for 5 years before leasing another apartment. They made their lives together there and built relationships with each other's families and with the Menuhin family. So Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, is the best known, but his sisters Yalta and Hepzibah were also performers and musicians. Both Cather and Lewis died in this apartment 25 years apart. Appropriately, Lewis's profound grief after Cather's death occupies a significant portion of this final chapter. And now we are back at the gravestone. The years after Cather's 1947 death corresponded to the Cold War panic over homosexuality, called by one historian the Lavender Scare. In my epilogue, I consider how this context enabled some to deny Cather's lesbian sexuality and to refuse to see Lewis for what she was and what she had been in Cather's life. Before I launch into part 2 about Cather and Lewis in the Southwest, I want to acknowledge the problematic aspects of Cather's representations of the peoples in this region, especially in Death Comes for the Archbishop. What drew Cather to the history on which she based her novel was the question of how Jean-Baptiste Lamy, a cultivated and cultured Frenchman, made sense of New Mexico. As she wrote in an essay published a few months after Death Comes for the Archbishop came out, she had wondered about Lamy for some years and had wanted to, quote, learn more about a pioneer churchman who looked so well-bred and distinguished in his pictures. One felt the same thing, something fearless and fine and very, very well-bred, something that spoke of race. What I felt curious about was the daily life of such a man in a crude frontier society. Cather entered fully into Lamy's point of view then and transformed him into Latour. The result is both beautiful and deeply problematic. Cather is at best guilty of cultural chauvinism, and at worst guilty of racism towards an erasure of the peoples who inhabited the lands of New Mexico before the United States took possession of it. These questions aren't at the center of my treatment of Cather and Lewis's Southwestern travels, but I want to make it clear that my aim in recovering the relationship, including as it played out in this place, is not to exonerate Cather's fiction from a fully justified critique of its racial politics. Cather and Lewis were very privileged Anglo tourists in New Mexico and other parts of the Southwest, as I myself was when I was footstepping them through the region for my research. And that privilege was central to their experiences. Now, however, I turn back to their experiences that informed the professor's house. Cather had traveled to the New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona area without Lewis in 1912 and 1914. And those trips informed the southwestern section of her novel, The Song of the Lark. Their first southwestern trip as a couple was in 1915, just as The Song of the Lark was being published. In Denver, where they spent 2 days at the Brown Palace Hotel, and that's a period photograph on the left, Cather talked to reporter Margaret Harvey of the Denver Times, that's on the right, telling her that she and Lewis would, quote, spend a few weeks at Mesa Verde National Park to see the old homes of the cliff dwellers, which Miss Cather plans to use in her next novel. In the desert Southwest, Cather and Lewis thought of themselves as having authentic experiences of place, while others were mere tourists, but they were tourists too. That they are again at Mesa Verde, the Anglo discoverers of the Mesa Verde ruins, the Wetherill brothers, were cowboys. And as the photographic evidence of Cather and Lewis' trip suggests, and especially Cather, they were playing cowboy at Mesa Verde. So there she's got on her cowboy hat. And there again, you see a cowboy hat. Mesa Verde is, of course, in Colorado, not New Mexico, but very close to the border between the states. The week the two women spent at Mesa Verde has long been well documented through a number of sources. But a decade ago, materials came into the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Library that provided information not otherwise accessible about their southwestern travels, including this crude bound volume that Edith Lewis picked up in Mancos, Colorado in 1915. A number of pages were cut out of the volume, by whom and when isn't clear, but what remains fleshes out their travels. The one detail of the Mesa Verde portion of their trip in 1915 that survives in the volume is Lewis's sketches of Mesa Verde Potts there on the left. She, like Cather, wore a khaki trouser suit in the ruins, but not a cowboy hat. And these sketches suggest that perhaps she was playing archaeologist more than cowboy. It wasn't until I myself went to Mesa Verde in 2018, my second visit, that I realized the sketches were not of modern pots, which is what I thought they were, but quite distinctly Mesa Verde pots. And it's the little ridges along the top that mark them as Mesa Verde pots. And here I am, in fact, being a privileged Anglo tourist, wearing a t-shirt I bought on my first trip to Mesa Verde in 1993. From Mesa Verde, Cather and Lewis went down to New Mexico, and the most interesting documentation of their 1950 travels are two maps Lewis drew in the journal volume. The penciled words and topographical details in this first map are hard to make out. The pencil's pretty faint, which is why I didn't use it in my book. But in it, Lewis depicts a variety of places and structures in the Taos vicinity. In the center of the map is a tiny sketch of the main plaza of Taos, with the Taos Pueblo to its right. The rivers and arroyos sprawl around the map, with the most notable human-built structures other than at the center are Los Rancho de Taos Church and buildings at Llano Quemado. Both of those are at the bottom right. Cather and Lewis's presence in Taos did not go unnoticed. In this tourist brochure created by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad to promote travel to northern New Mexico, Miss Cather and Miss Lewis are listed among first-timers in Taos, the Taos summer art scene. While this map follows traditional cartographic conventions, the other map in the volume, here's the second one, is quite peculiar, but also particularly revealing because it tells the story of a journey. In fact, it tells the story of a journey Cather mentioned in her essay on Death Comes to the Archbishop that I mentioned earlier. Referring back to the teens, she explained, quote, "There were no automobile roads and no hotels off the main lines of a railroad. One had to travel by wagon and carry a camp outfit. It was then very difficult to find anyone who would tell me anything about the country or even the roads. One of the most intelligent and inspiriting persons I found in my travels was a Belgian priest, Father Halterman, and his name is on the right of the map there, who lived with his sister in the parsonage behind the beautiful old church at Santa Cruz, New Mexico. Father Halterman, as she explained, ministered both to Santa Cruz Parish and his 18 Indian missions with a spring wagon and a pair of mules. He shared with her, she claimed, a great deal about the Indians and their traditions. Cather doesn't mention Lewis in this account, but she clearly was there, recording their trip that began in Española, designated by a tiny sketch of a train at the lower left, where they rented their wagon and camping kit and crossed the river to Santa Cruz and Santa Cruz de la Cañada Church. From there, they crossed back over the river and traveled into the lands of Owengue Pueblo, then called San Juan Pueblo. Right at about the center of the page is San Juan Bautista Church at the Pueblo with its smaller chapel across the road. Cather wrote Ferris Greenslet, her editor and publisher at Houghton Mifflin, shortly after she left the Southwest in 1915, quote, "I will certainly have another book ready by the end of the year. It will probably be the story of the Southwest, and the title will probably be The Blue Mesa, or something of that sort, and it will be full of love and hate." In 1916, she wrote Greenslet from Denver in June, quote, "I am on my way to Taos, New Mexico, and the Santa Clara Pueblos and the Black Mesa," which is to say that she was heading back into the places depicted on this map here, Lewis's map from the year before. Soon, however, Cather put aside the Blue Mesa and another Southwestern themed book, a travel book, to write My Antonia, which is set in Nebraska, and she and Lewis did not return to the Southwest until 1924. Before they returned, however, Cather took up the discarded Blue Mesa and turned it into the middle section of The Professor's House. The first and third sections of that novel are from the perspective of a Midwestern history professor having a midlife crisis, while the middle section is a first-person narrative spoken years earlier by one of his students who died in World War I about his experiences discovering cliff dweller ruins at the Blue Mesa during his earlier cowboy days. This section of the novel is titled Tom Outland's Story. When people talk about Tom Outland's story, they talk about the Mesa Verde ruins in Colorado. And clearly, Cather went to Mesa Verde to gather material and experiences that would inform the Blue Mesa. However, what is much less frequently noted is that Tom Outland's story in the professor's house is quite insistently located in northern New Mexico, not southwestern Colorado. As Tom describes the Blue Mesa, and as you can see of the Black Mesa here on the map, it was one of the landmarks we always saw from Pardee, a fictional town. Landmarks mean so much in a flat country. It looked from our town like a naked blue rock set down alone in the plain, almost square, except that the top was higher at one end. And here is Edith Lewis editing that passage in the professor's house. While the ruins located in a canyon bisecting the fictional Blue Mesa are modeled on the Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, the Mesa Verde Formation is absolutely nothing like the fictional Blue Mesa. And these photographs of a topographical model of the formation at the Park Visitor Center amply demonstrate that. And here we also have, don't have that map, sorry. But in any event, if you look at this, yes, it's not a singular mesa standing out in the flat landscape. In 2018, then, I felt certain that the outsized feature at the top of this map labeled Black Mesa that had so attracted Cather and Lewis in 1915 and 1916 had inspired Cather's Blue Mesa, but where was the Black Mesa? Well, in 2018, I drove frantically around for a couple of days looking at various Black Mesas. There are many Black Mesas in New Mexico, which more properly would be called Mesas Negras. It was not until I returned home to Nebraska, however, that I began to suspect that Lewis actually had drawn Mesa Prieta, more accurately translated as Dark Mesa, a 36 square mile basalt mesa at the confluence of the Rio Grande and the Rio Chama. And Hannah Abelbeck, photo archivist at the New Mexico History Museum, helped me to confirm this identification by locating historic photographs that corresponded to Lewis's map. And here is one of them. This is Okeowenge with the mesa in the background. And this other one, it's actually later than that period. The buildings have been changed, but you can see here, juxtaposing this photograph with the detail from Lewis's map, the photograph makes clear that she and Cather encountered Mesa Prieta while traveling through and standing on the grounds of Okeowenge, because you can see the church there in the middle and the chapel. To recur to my point about the problematics of Cather's representations of New Mexico and Tom Outland's story, Cather made the living indigenous people occupying the land she fictionalized vanish. She depicted Tom Outland encountering the northern New Mexico strangely evacuated of living Pueblo peoples while relocating the Cliff Palace ruins from Mesa Verde into that place. In 1925, 9 years after their second visit together to New Mexico, Cather and Lewis returned. Their plans were rather vague to start, except that they had made reservations for late June at the San Gabriel Ranch in Alcalde, New Mexico. There, they planned to and did read the page proofs of the professor's house, which was then appearing serially in a magazine and was scheduled for book publication in the fall. Finding what remains of the San Gabriel and learning about its history was one of the great thrills of my research travel. As I mentioned earlier, Cather and Lewis represented themselves as non-tourists, but the San Gabriel was a dude ranch, and a very high-class one at that. It was so expensive that staff reportedly checked guests' credit reports before accepting reservations. If you have read Leslie Poland-Kemp's Ladies of the Canyons, Carol Fefley, who owned the ranch with her husband, is a primary figure in Poland-Kemp's book. These marvelous photos here were used in the ranch's advertising brochure, which Cather and Lewis might have seen. In both photos, a native man in a blanket is a sort of prop, posed in his blanket to complete the cowboys and Indian tableau. On the left, high-hatted cowboys are shooting craps with horses in the background, and a cowgirl in chaps next to the native man, while on the right, a cowboy is talking to two female tourists in riding breeches, getting them ready for a trail ride. The Black Mesa on Edith Lewis's map is close by the property, And this is a photograph of Alcalde from the period. And actually, what you just see there in the background, that horizon line rising above it, is part of the Black Mesa or Mesa Prieta. I think this is why they chose the Dude Ranch in Alcalde as a place to read the page proofs of the professor's house. The adobe structures around the patio that house guests, go back to this photograph, you see some of that, date back to the Spanish colonial era and are still in use in an Easterseals programming facility of some kind. Although when I was there in 2018, absolutely no one was around. The Grand Ranch House, where the Fefleys lived, is now part of the New Mexico State University Agricultural Research Station. And in 2018, it was occupied but crumbling, shrouded in tarps. In 1925, Cather and Lewis had rather vague notions of what they would do after their time at the San Gabriel Ranch was up. As many of you know, Cather ended up at Mabel Dodge Lujan's compound in Taos that summer. But how did she get there? Most descriptions of Cather's time there rely on Edith Lewis's memoir of Willa Cather living, and yet they often ignore Lewis's presence. Not only was Lewis there, in a roundabout yet traceable way, she was responsible for Mabel Lujan avidly pursuing Cather that summer. And that's Mabel on the left and her husband, Tony Lujan, on the right. You may recall that I said Lewis's college roommate, Oxa Barlow, was an important character in my book. Through the early 1920s, Oxa and her husband, Earl Brewster, both of them painters, lived in Italy, where Edith Lewis visited them in 1914. In 1921, the Brewsters met B.H. and Frida Lawrence in Capri, and they became fast friends, traveling to Ceylon together. In 1924, when the Lawrences came through New York City with painter Dorothy Brett, it was the Brewsters who facilitated Cather and Lewis, inviting them to tea at Greenwich Village, their Greenwich Village apartment. And then in the summer of 1925, it was the Lawrences, then occupying their ranch in the mountains north of Taos, who urged Lujan to persuade Cather to come to Taos. If you go to the Mabel Dodge Lujan house in Taos, as I did in 2018, and here are the photographs, you might be led to believe that Cather and Lewis stayed in the Willa Cather room in the single-story structures where guests stay today. So on the left is the main big tall part of the house, and then the lower structures where most of the guests stay on the right. No, they stayed at the Pink House, a now decrepit two-story adobe across from Lujan's main house that is not part of the current facility. Yet again, materials that came into my university's library in 2011 provide details of what Cather and Lewis did in New Mexico in 1925, recorded in this little school composition notebook. Here we see Lewis's brief day-by-day account of their time at Lujan's place, which involved alternating riding horseback with being driven around the region by Tony Lujan in his touring car. There's a lot more in this notebook, in which Cather and Lewis both wrote. But to return to Lewis's record of their movements in Taos, Padre Martinez appears on the margin next to the entry for one day. That's sort of on the lower left of the list. They were pursuing information and experiences that would inform the novel that began gestating in Cather's brain as a result of this trip. Death Comes to the Archbishop. Research for the novel would bring the two women back to New Mexico in 1926, at which time they visited Pecos, climbed to the top of Acoma, and rode into Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. I could give you much more detail here about how their experiences informed the novel, but I'll leave that for you to learn from reading my book. But why has Edith Lewis remained virtually invisible in most accounts of the genesis of Cather's novel? Cather's pasting of these photographs into her copy of Death Comes to the Archbishop make it abundantly clear she and Lewis had these experiences together. She also inscribed a copy of the novel to Edith Lewis, who discovered the Archbishop with me. I will close with some of my favorite images and quotations that cast some light on how Lewis was made to vanish and how I brought her back. First, in 1926, a very young Paul Horgan, who would go on to write a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Archbishop Leibniz, stumbled on Cather and Lewis in a balcony at the La Fonda Hotel in 1926. And here's a picture of Willa Cather taken by Edith Lewis on a balcony at the La Fonda in 1926. This is how he later remembered the encounter. Quote, "In the deepest corner of the porch were two steamer chairs, and upon them reclined two ladies whose concentration I disturbed. They were busy with papers and pencils. I have an impression of many accessories, notebooks, open volumes, steamer rugs against the vagrant breezes which feel cool to some out of the sun in Santa Fe. The nearer of the two ladies turned upon me a light blue regard of such annoyance and distaste at my intrusion that I was gone too quickly to make more than a sweeping impression of where I had been. Horgan recognized one of the ladies as Cather and presumed the other to be her secretary. He didn't introduce himself, but a year later, when the novel came out, he reflected on the fact that, quote, she was working only 100 yards from Lemies Cathedral, and that's in the background, as you can see, whose humble beauties she was the first to recognize. So one reason Lewis vanished is the presumption that she was Cather's secretary rather than her partner and literary collaborator. Another reason she's often so hard to grasp is that so few images of her were available before I began my research. On the left in this slide is what was one of the most widely reproduced images of Lewis. She stands alone, her face shadowed by her hat as she squints into the sun. On the right, she is standing with Willa Cather's twin nieces, Margaret and Elizabeth, children of Willa's brother Roscoe and his wife Meta. Roscoe, Meta, and their three daughters joined Cather and Lewis in Santa Fe in 1926. And these pictures, with an adobe wall in the background, were taken when they were taking Lewis to the train station for her return journey to New York City, where she had to get back to work writing advertising copy. And here's Cather with, as you can see, the same nieces on the steps of the cathedral and with the statue of Lamy. When we can see that Lewis was fully visible to and recognized by Cather's biological family, she becomes more visible to us. And finally, even as scholars made Edith Lewis vanish, Mabel Lujan did not misperceive Lewis as Cather's secretary or ignore her. Both Cather and Lewis became Lujan's friends and correspondents, and Lujan fully recognized them as a couple. As much as Cather's representations of Mexican and indigenous people in Death Comes for the Archbishop warrant critique, Cather's feelings for Lewis are what give the novel its beauty and its poignancy. As Mabel Lujan wrote in the 1950s, in a reminiscence about Taos in the 1920s, the book that came out of Willa when she left Taos was better loved than all of her other books. Perhaps there is more love in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Homestead. That was wonderful. What an insightful look at Cather and Lewis in New Mexico. How about a few questions?
Sure.
Cather was born in post-Civil War Virginia and moved with her family to the Nebraska prairie, and early on wanted to become a medical doctor. But she changed her mind at the University of Nebraska to become a writer after one of her writing assignments was published in the local paper, and write she did. Cather wrote about a variety of subjects: European immigrant heroines in My Antonia, Nebraska Prairie in Old Pioneers, World War I in One of Ours, 19th century Quebec in Shadows of the Rock, as well as Our New Mexico, with Death Comes for the Archbishop and the Professor's House. What intrigued Cather to write about such different subjects and themes?
Well, I would say that there's actually a lot of continuity, even though summarized that way, they sound radically different. So, from that quotation that I read from her essay about Death Comes to the Archbishop, for example, she talks about Archbishop Lamy as a European immigrant to the American Southwest. And I know when I've taught that novel, then students who at first feel like they have landed on a different planet from the novels that are about Nebraska, or Nebraska decides she sort of moves Nebraska around, right? So like in the Song of the Lark, she calls Red Cloud Nebraska, Moonstone, Colorado, or she moves it in stories to Kansas, but it still seems to be very much Nebraska. And so it seemed to them to be very odd, but when we read that essay, then it became fully legible to them. Shadows on the Rock also is about French immigrants to 17th century Quebec. So I think that's one of her major themes. And there are also letters where, she talks about when she's changing publishers. It seems that Houghton Mifflin, she fell out with her editor, and she felt this precious thought to write the same thing over and over again. And she had this quite sort of funny metaphor that's saying that, as in crops, right, rotating your crops and rotating your subject matter is good in both ways. So I think that for her, there was an artistic challenge. But then there's also just surprising continuities when you think about it.
Thank you. Did Cather prefer to focus on character driven, subject driven, or location driven stories, or all of the above?
Yeah. I think she would resist the idea that those really were entirely separate, and that she does all of those things. She's certainly known for her representations of place, but it's also the relationship of characters to place that's important to her. So especially people who migrate. And I think it's also interesting that Cather herself grew up, well, spent the first, about decade of her life in Virginia, then moved to Nebraska, then moved to Pittsburgh, then moved to New York City, and she traveled quite a bit. So the relationship of people to place changes, and in fact, it's movement, the movement of people that drives all of her works. And she herself, even though she wrote famous novels about Nebraska. After she left, it seems that she never really wrote about Nebraska in Nebraska. New Mexico, she actually wrote about, well, she later denied that she had written any part of Death Comes to the Archbishop in Mary Austin's house, because Mary Austin was criticizing the novel, and Austin thought that the introduction of French culture into the Southwest by the French priests was disastrous, and Cather was very engaged by that. And she said, "No, no, no, I didn't write any of my book in Mary Austin's house." But there's actually letters describing working on the novel in 1926 in Mary Austin's house, and then there's also a copy of the novel inscribed from Willa Cather to Mary Austin, thanking her for the hospitality of her house to work in 1926. So yeah, it's complicated, it's complicated. I don't think she would separate them.
Thank you. Thank you. Cather graduated from the University of Nebraska, and you are the director of the Cather Project at the university. Can you tell us a little bit about the Cather Project and also talk about the cooperative venture with the Willa Cather Archive at the University of Nebraska Lincoln?
Sure. The Cather Project has been for a number of years now working on something called the Willa Cather Scholarly Edition, which is a sort of presents a full critical analysis of all of the versions of Cather's novels, if it was serialized, providing documentation of how it changed for book publication, if there are pre-publication forms like manuscripts or typed drafts, providing comparisons and providing a full, historical annotation of the novels. And we've got one still left, My Mortal Enemy. So that's been an important part of the Cather Project. Also sponsor the publication of Cather Studies, which is key to the Willa Cather International Seminar theme, and scholarly essays are published in volumes by the University of Nebraska Press. We sponsor visiting scholars to come use collections and to speak, and we've contributed to artistic adaptations to the costs and provided knowledge for artistic adaptations. Been collaborating quite a bit with the Willa Cather Archive, which is a website that provides in digital form all sorts of information and objects. You can look at photographs of Cather, you can read Cather's letters, you can see versions of all of her books that are in the public domain. So I think we haven't quite gotten the Death Comes to the Archbishop on the internet yet, but it will be soon, working on that. And the most recent thing that we have really been working on, or just started to work on, we've got funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities for something called the Digital Library of Willa Cather's Literary Manuscripts, which will provide access to all of those pre-publication forms of Cather's works. There will be over 6,000 page images,
Mm.
and introductions, and something called metadata, which is basically information about information, so that you could sort of track Cather's creative process and understand what you're seeing when you look at images of these documents on the screen, including making sure you can understand when Edith Lewis's handwriting is on them. So
Thank you. Thank you. In addition to writing extensively about Willa Cather, you also write about American women's writing from the colonial era through the 19th century. What drew you to that period of time in women's literature, and who were some of those women writers?
well, it's funny. I wrote an undergraduate honors thesis on Willa Cather in 1984 and 85, at which time I had read very few American women before 1900. And I loved grad school a couple of times. And when I went back, I sort of got sucked back into the earlier period because I was interested in how copyright law affected American literature. And there's an important copyright case about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and about a German translation for the American market. And once I got back there, I stayed there for a while and just became very interested in publishing history and in the circumstances in which women wrote. And I think too, there's a notion that someone like Willa Cather is almost the beginning of women having access to publication. And it's just not at all true. Actually, women really dominated the market for fiction before the 20th century. They kind of got pushed out. And so it's just been really fascinating to recover the ways that women, 200 years ago, some of them were very successful in their publishing careers. And Willa Cather actually kind of scoffs at most women from before then. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, I don't think she ever even mentions Stowe, but E.D.N. Southworth is one author I've done quite a bit of work on, and she wrote a newspaper column when she was still, it's like in the, let me think, it was the very early 20th century. She visited her cottage, and she's quite scoffing about a woman who was so popular and wrote so many novels. Sarah Orne Jewett's an exception. I mentioned her. She really admired Jewett's work and got to know her personally at the very end of her life. She was an important mentor. Susanna Rowson, the author of the first bestseller in the United States, Charlotte Temple. I've done quite a bit of work on her. Fanny Fern, who was a humorous novelist and newspaper columnist. So there are just quite a few of them. Augusta Jane Evans, who was the best-selling author of the Confederate States of America. Yeah, there are many of them, and I do love teaching them as well as researching them.
The women who came over the Santa Fe Trail, as well as the Oregon Trail, a lot of them were doing daily diaries.
Mhm, mhm.
Were Did many of those women take their diaries and turn them into novels?
Not so far as I know. I mean, I know that a lot of those diaries, got published close to the time they were written or later. Scholars have recovered them. I mean, I would say that I think people who find out about those diaries sometimes think like this is the only access we have to women's voices from the past, or things like diaries and letters, which is not at all true, right? The published writings, and there were published writings about the American West defined in various ways all the way back into the 19th century. So it's not like writing about the West doesn't happen until the 20th century. Women were writing about the West as early as men were. So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, Dr. Homestead, as you know, this lecture is pre recorded, so our audience is not able to ask you questions in real time. Can audience members reach out to you at your email address if they have a question?
Certainly, I'll do my best to respond.
And I believe that email is mhomestead 2 at unl.edu, correct?
Yes, and I'm very easy to find because I am the only, so far as I know, Melissa Homestead in the whole world.
Great, great. Well, Dr. Homestead, do you have any final comments before we wrap up today?
Oh, I would just say enjoy reading Willa Cather, enjoy the places, but always be critical and thoughtful, because I think that's the best way to read literature. We don't have to be what scholars would call hagiographers to praise everything. I think you can value a work of literature even as you are sometimes critical of what the author is doing and its effects.
Thank you again, Dr. Melissa J. Homestead. This was very excellent.
Thanks.
In closing, a reminder to visit our website at friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can watch past First Wednesday lectures. Click on the lecture series link at the top of the page, then click on past lectures to see the list. If you wish to learn more about the Friends of History and our lectures and other activities, join our mailing list or email us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. And finally, please consider making a donation to Friends of History through our website so that we can continue to support the programs at the New Mexico History Museum. And thank you to all of you who have contributed to the Friends of History. We'll see you next month. Thank you and goodbye.